The atmosphere inside the Ed Sullivan Theater that night was electric, more electric than usual, even for a venue known for mixing politics, celebrity, and punchlines. Stephen Colbert, as usual, opened the night with his typical blend of charm and sharp satire, easing the crowd into laughter as he delivered his monologue. It was the kind of monologue that clipped headlines into digestible jokes, poking at the news cycle with the precision of a late-night scalpel. But even as he smiled and teased, the audience seemed to buzz with anticipation. The real event of the evening wasn't the opening jokes or even the musical guest. It was Denzel Washington. Washington had agreed to appear on Colbert's show to promote a stage production he was backing, a bold adaptation of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. The project had already stirred discussion in literary and political circles for its timing and unapologetic message. But the moment Denzel walked on stage, the atmosphere shifted. Gone was the easy charisma of previous visits. There was a weight in his demeanor, a seriousness that eclipsed the usual light banter of late-night fare. Colbert welcomed him with the usual warmth, but even his smile seemed slightly more rehearsed than sincere. The first few minutes followed the standard rhythm. Some jokes about aging in Hollywood, an anecdote about directing actors who were too intimidated to improvise in front of him. But as the interview shifted into deeper territory, race, censorship, and America's shifting cultural conscience, everything changed. "Let me ask you something, Denzel," Colbert began, fingers laced on his desk. "With all this talk about freedom of speech and cancel culture, don't you think we're losing our sense of humor?" The question wasn't unusual. It had become a go-to topic for many shows. But Denzel didn't blink. He leaned slightly forward, his voice slow, measured, and unmistakably sharp. "You're asking me if the issue is that we've lost our sense of humor," he said. "But I think maybe we've just gotten tired of laughing at pain that never belonged to the people telling the jokes." The room fell quiet. Colbert shifted in his chair. For a moment, even the camera crew hesitated to cut away. Denzel continued. "When a black boy gets choked on the sidewalk, it's not a skit. When a mother watches her son grow up afraid of police lights, it's not edgy content. That's trauma. And when we label it controversial to say so, what we're really doing is asking for permission to keep looking away." Colbert smiled tightly. "No one's asking to look away," he countered. "I think the point is, if we can't laugh, then how do we cope?" Denzel paused. Then he said something that would later echo across social media. "Maybe instead of laughing, we start listening." There was a beat of silence. Then Colbert, pushing back more forcefully than expected, asked, "Don't you think that sounds a bit moralizing? People come here to feel good." Denzel nodded. "And that's the problem. Feeling good while others feel broken. We've made comfort a currency. But what we need is discomfort. Because that's what real change grows out of." The audience murmured. It wasn't heckling. It wasn't applause. It was tension, a visible reckoning. Colbert, rarely ever shaken, reached for his blue cards, shuffled them, then looked back up. "Okay," he said. "Let's pivot to something a little lighter." But Denzel didn't pivot. "No, let's stay here. You invited me here. And this isn't off topic. This is the topic." At that moment, a floor producer could be seen gesturing off camera. Colbert's eyes flicked briefly to the side, just a flicker, but enough for someone like Denzel to catch. The host tried again to steer the conversation back toward Hollywood. But Denzel wasn't done. "We talk about unity," he said, "but unity without truth is just denial in a prettier outfit." Then, in an unprecedented move, Colbert tried to cut to commercial early. Denzel leaned back, eyebrows raised. "Commercial break," he said, half smiling. "You need a breather, Stephen?" Colbert forced a chuckle. "Just trying to keep the lights on, Denzel." But the audience didn't laugh, and neither did Denzel. "The lights are on," he said. "The question is whether we're ready to see what's in the room." When the show returned from its rush break, the dynamic had shifted completely. Denzel wasn't on the couch. Colbert sat alone. The audience, unsure of what had just happened, offered lukewarm applause as the next segment was introduced. No explanation was given, but the internet didn't wait for one. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Hash Denzel Drop Truth, hash Colbert Clash, hash Theron Gotriel. By morning, clips of the exchange had gone viral. News outlets scrambled to spin it. Liberal commentators hailed Denzel for refusing to let late-night TV whitewash pain. Conservative pundits accused him of hijacking entertainment with wokeness. But no one denied what had happened. A confrontation between celebrity comfort and civic discomfort had taken place on live television. And as one Twitter user summed it up in a single post that would be retweeted over 100,000 times, Colbert wanted a cameo, Denzel brought a reckoning. In the hours after the show aired, media executives, PR teams, and cultural commentators scrambled to control the narrative. CBS released a vague statement. Due to time constraints, part of our interview with Mr. Washington was not aired in full. We are grateful for his appearance. But people weren't buying it. Within 24 hours, the internet had pieced together what happened during that commercial break. Leaked footage, likely from a backstage phone recording, showed Denzel speaking with a staffer, calm but unmoved. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't being escorted out by security. He simply left, refusing to allow his voice to be softened for primetime comfort. In the short clip, he can be heard saying, "If I can't speak freely, then what's the point of inviting me here?" The video went viral faster than the actual show segment. People were divided, predictably so, but many weren't. Many were simply stunned that one of America's most universally respected figures, Denzel Washington, the Oscar-winning actor known for his discipline and dignity, had drawn a clear line. And he did it on a stage where stars usually just smile, sell, and sidestep. Meanwhile, Colbert said nothing for 2 days. Not on his show. Not online. The silence was deafening. It sparked even more curiosity. Had he been told to drop it by CBS brass? Was he embarrassed? Or was he deliberately hoping the news cycle would move on? But it didn't. In fact, it snowballed. Activists, artists, and everyday viewers began sharing clips from the interview alongside footage from Denzel's past speeches, his commencement addresses, his interviews about faith, race, and responsibility. They created a narrative that wasn't just about a clash between two public figures. It was about who gets to control the tone of truth in the media. What Denzel had said on that stage, and the calm with which he said it, hit harder than any viral moment engineered for outrage. This wasn't shouting. This wasn't chaos. This was a man refusing to play the game. As the cultural dust started to settle, journalists began investigating further. A well-connected media columnist published an op-ed in The Atlantic titled, "The Night Denzel Broke Late Night." It detailed how producers were caught off guard by the depth of his comments and how execs in the control room debated whether to cut the segment entirely. The article also revealed that during rehearsals earlier in the day, Denzel had made it clear, "I'm not here to play make-believe. If I'm coming on, we're talking about what matters." But perhaps the most surprising ripple effect of all came from within Hollywood itself. Actors, directors, and producers began posting cryptic messages, clearly in solidarity. Regina King tweeted, "Sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes comfort isn't truth." Denzel said what needed to be said. Mahershala Ali followed. He walked in a room full of cameras and chose honesty over optics. That's what real leadership looks like. Even more notable was the post from an anonymous screenwriter account widely rumored to belong to someone on Colbert's writing staff. It was never supposed to go down like that. But no one could stop it once he started. And honestly, we shouldn't have. Colbert, facing mounting pressure, finally addressed the moment on his Monday broadcast. His statement, however, was met with mixed reactions. Last week, we had Denzel Washington on this show, and things got a little tense, he began. "We didn't agree on everything, but I respect him. I've always respected him. And if I seemed uncomfortable, it's because truth, when it's raw, can be uncomfortable." The monologue was safe, measured, but it didn't apologize. Nor did it acknowledge that Denzel was not being raw or abrasive, he was simply being clear. For many, Colbert's statement came across not as an olive branch, but as a deflection. And Denzel? He remained characteristically silent. Until 5 days later, when he appeared, by surprise, on a podcast hosted by writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. The hour-long conversation was recorded in a quiet Harlem bookstore with no audience and no stage. But its impact dwarfed everything else. I went on that show knowing exactly what I wanted to say, Denzel began, his voice calm. But I also knew that saying it on television was going to make some people nervous. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too honest. Ta-Nehisi nodded. There's always been this tension between platforms and people, between the truth and the structure designed to contain it. Denzel agreed. Look, I love this country. I've lived long enough to know its ugliness and its beauty. But I also know that when you start confusing comfort with justice, when you start thinking you're helping just by smiling through somebody else's pain, you're part of the problem. He didn't slam Colbert by name. In fact, he was generous. Stephen's a good man. Smart. Witty. But even the smartest people can get caught protecting the system they benefit from. The interview drew millions of listeners in a single weekend. Clips from it spread across every platform: Instagram, TikTok, X, YouTube. But perhaps the most unexpected endorsement came from Gen Z creators. TikTokers, usually more focused on pranks and trends, started stitching Denzel's podcast footage with their own commentary. One 19-year-old creator went viral for saying, "Y'all, my generation grew up watching these people act like the world was okay as long as we were laughing. But this man? He said nah. He said look deeper. And he did it without yelling or canceling anyone. That's how you drop a truth bomb." The term truth bomb began trending alongside #Denzel Washington and #Late Night Reckoning. Meanwhile, CBS found itself in a difficult position. Ratings for Colbert dipped that week, not significantly, but noticeably. Sponsors began asking quiet questions. How could a show known for being progressive be seen now as gatekeeping truth? In response, CBS scheduled a town hall-style segment, Reckoning on Air, the future of free speech, promoted as a transparent look into how late-night television handles complex cultural topics. But critics saw it as damage control. More importantly, it highlighted a truth that Denzel had forced into the open. Late-night TV wasn't just about laughs anymore. It never had been. It was about controlling the tone of the national conversation. And once that control was broken, once someone like Denzel refused to play along, the facade crumbled. And in that crumbling, something new began to emerge. By the end of the month, other celebrities started turning down traditional late-night interviews, opting instead for podcasts, live streams, and YouTube channels where they could speak freely without the filter of network editing. A quiet rebellion was unfolding, not one of noise, but of refusal. Refusal to be polished for prime time. Refusal to dilute truth. Refusal to turn trauma into trendy talking points. And it had all started with one guest, who chose honesty over applause. The cultural wave triggered by Denzel Washington's quiet yet powerful walk-off had now become an unstoppable current. It had moved beyond the realm of entertainment gossip. This was no longer about one actor or one show. It was about the larger machinery, how Hollywood, media, and politics often merge to manufacture narratives, and how rare it is for someone to disrupt that process. Colleges across the U.S. used the incident in media ethics classes. Professors at institutions like NYU and USC used the footage and fallout to illustrate the increasingly blurred line between news and performance. One professor in particular, Dr. Eliza Harmon, delivered a lecture that went viral. In it, she stated, Denzel didn't explode. He didn't grandstand. He simply chose not to comply. And that's more radical in today's media landscape than any protest sign. Students posted her speech across social media. Suddenly, The phrase radical refusal began trending. It wasn't about outrage. It was about calm disruption, deliberate disengagement. Denzel had turned down the applause and in doing so, got the attention of millions. Meanwhile, industry insiders were still trying to assess the damage or perhaps the opportunity. Talent agents quietly started advising clients to reevaluate their late-night appearances. A-list celebrities began asking a new question during pre-interview meetings. Will I be allowed to speak, or am I just here to promote? In that space, independent media surged. YouTube creators who had previously struggled to get traction on celebrity commentary suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with traffic. They weren't just reacting to Denzel's interview, they were building on it. An entire mini-documentary genre was born overnight, focusing on what one creator called the unsaid rules of TV truth. One particularly powerful video broke down the structure of Colbert's interview. Frame by frame, it analyzed the host's body language, the shift in audience reactions, the visible discomfort of the production team. The narrator explained, "You can literally watch the system freeze." This wasn't just Denzel throwing a wrench in the gears, it was him asking why the gears were spinning the way they were. It became one of the most viewed political cultural commentary videos of the year. And it wasn't created by a network or a studio. It was made by a 27-year-old in their basement studio with a borrowed microphone. As the online momentum continued, politicians began weighing in. Predictably, some tried to capitalize. A few right-wing figures, eager to co-opt Denzel's words without context, started tweeting out clips implying he was criticizing liberal media. But that backfired, because Denzel himself had never made it partisan, and the full interview, especially his conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, was deeply grounded in values, justice, honesty, and personal responsibility. So when commentators attempted to twist it for their own agendas, they were met with instant correction. In one of the more poignant responses, Ava DuVernay posted, "Denzel isn't a pawn. He's not auditioning for your politics. He's challenging the whole board." And it wasn't just celebrities defending him. Everyday people joined the conversation. Veterans, teachers, church leaders, working class parents, they all found something in Denzel's actions that resonated. For some, it was his clarity. For others, it was the dignity with which he handled being sidelined. But for most, it was the fact that he didn't flinch when the room shifted. Colbert, for his part, was still catching up to the cultural shockwave. He began booking guests with more serious profiles, activists, journalists, authors. The show tried to frame it as growth, but viewers weren't convinced. The ratings saw a small rebound, but engagement had changed. The comment sections were filled with people asking why it took a public disruption for the show to invite deeper voices. In an attempt to reclaim the narrative, Colbert's producers reached out to Denzel's team, quietly suggesting a follow-up appearance, on Denzel's terms, as one insider described. But Denzel declined, and that refusal, once again, was louder than any return. Instead, Denzel continued engaging with smaller, independent platforms. He appeared in a powerful, stripped-down interview with a young black journalist from Atlanta, someone whose platform was tiny compared to CBS, but whose questions were sharp, real, and human. That interview became a moment of its own. In it, the journalist asked, "Why speak here when you could have gone back and said your piece to millions?" Denzel's response was simple: "Millions heard me already, but not everyone listened. You don't need a stadium to be heard. You need a space where truth doesn't get edited." The quote was shared everywhere. It was painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, even used in college commencement speeches. And perhaps that was the ultimate irony. Denzel's most powerful statement came not through volume, but through selective silence. By refusing to go back, by not engaging in the endless cycle of rebuttal and PR spin, he created a space that no network could control. A space where people filled in the silence with their own questions and began seeking their own answers. Back in Hollywood, studio execs began meeting to discuss the Denzel factor. That's how they referred to it. Not as a scandal, not even as a controversy, but as a shift, a redefinition of what audiences were willing to accept and what they were now beginning to demand. One unnamed executive told Variety, "We used to think audiences wanted to be entertained, period. But now, they want to know if we're telling the truth, or at least trying to." And it wasn't just talk. A-list actors began renegotiating interview contracts. They wanted approval over final edits. They wanted longer, more meaningful segments. They wanted conversations, not sound bites. The media infrastructure was, slowly, beginning to feel the pressure. But perhaps the most stunning sign of cultural change came 6 weeks after the original incident. That's when Colbert's writers aired a parody sketch, a self-aware, almost uncomfortable skit where an actor dressed as Denzel walked off a fictional talk show after being interrupted one too many times. The audience laughed awkwardly. Some clapped. Some cringed. Online, the response was swift. "Now you're mocking the man who made you question your own show?" wrote one critic. "You don't get to laugh at something you never really owned up to," another added. The backlash was so immediate that the segment was pulled from all official uploads within 24 hours. And that marked the unofficial end of Colbert's attempts to pivot. He continued his show, of course. Ratings stabilized, but something had changed. A layer of polish had worn off. The illusion of control, over tone, over audience, over truth, had cracked. And in that fracture, a new form of conversation was being born. One not managed by applause signs or commercial breaks. One that didn't require makeup chairs or cue cards. One that didn't punish discomfort, but rather invited it. Because when a man like Denzel Washington quietly stands his ground on a stage designed for safe laughs, and instead chooses truth over applause, he doesn't just challenge a show. He challenges a system. And people listen, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. Weeks passed, but the ripple effect of that one quiet storm, Denzel's walk-off, continued to move through every layer of American culture. It had stopped being about Denzel alone. His silence had echoed into spaces that were once close to such disruption: newsrooms, classrooms, political offices, and even churches. What's most telling about a cultural shift is not who starts it, but who tries to stop it. And in the case of this new wave of media accountability, that resistance came swiftly, often disguised as concern, context, or corporate policy. Certain media figures began subtly undermining Denzel's move. They didn't attack him directly. Instead, they used terms like breakdown, ego, or misunderstood moment when discussing the incident. They framed it as a glitch in the otherwise smooth system of celebrity appearances. But people weren't buying it. The public had witnessed what actually happened. A man of dignity and clarity was invited to speak, interrupted repeatedly, and ultimately dismissed under the guise of keeping the show on track. And when he refused to play along, the system called him difficult. Sound familiar? It was the same tactic historically used against truth tellers, especially black truth tellers, throughout modern media history. From Muhammad Ali to Nina Simone to James Baldwin, the story has remained eerily consistent. Challenge the format, and the format will challenge you. And this time, it happened on one of the most watched platforms in America, which is why the people didn't let the moment fade. Clips of the incident were now being used in campaigns. Not political ones, public trust campaigns. Nonprofits, mental health advocates, and media literacy groups all began incorporating Denzel's moment as a case study in standing firm. One nonprofit launched a billboard campaign with his image and the words, "When the mic cuts off, let your silence speak." It was powerful, not as hero worship, but as an invitation to reimagine courage. And it came at a moment when America was already grappling with its media credibility crisis. Trust in legacy news was at an all-time low. Cable ratings were falling. Podcasting had exploded. And so, Denzel's act landed not just as a cultural event, but as a challenge to the hierarchy of narrative making. The audience wasn't just consuming anymore. They were curating, investigating, and challenging. People started replaying older interviews, not just Denzel's, but those of other artists who had been dismissed or silenced. One video went viral titled 20 Times Celebs Tried to Speak Truth and Got Cut Off. Denzel's moment was hash one, but the others? They painted a broader picture, a systemic one. It wasn't about one man being interrupted. It was about why that interruption had to happen and what it protected. The clip of Denzel calmly saying, "You invited me here, but you don't want to hear me," became a meme, yes, but also a rallying cry. People began using the quote in their own lives. Teachers posted it in classrooms. Therapists used it to teach boundary setting. Even HR professionals began referencing it in workplace training about listening and respect. Meanwhile, late night TV found itself cornered. The traditional formula was being dissected. The celebrity plus punchline plus applause format wasn't aging well. More viewers were turning to long-form interviews on platforms like YouTube or independent podcasts. People craved depth, not just decoration. Some hosts tried to adapt. Trevor Noah, who had already left The Daily Show, recorded an impromptu reaction video discussing Denzel's moment. In it, he shared, "We're trained to think airtime is permission, but sometimes being handed a microphone doesn't mean you're really being heard." Denzel saw that, and he walked away. And the silence that followed? That's what exposed the structure. The video exploded. It gained millions of views in days. And it set a tone that other influencers couldn't ignore. Soon, even brands were trying to capitalize on the authenticity wave. One ad campaign misfired entirely, using a Denzel look-alike in a commercial about finding your truth. The backlash was brutal. Consumers flooded the brand's social media with comments like, "You can't sell dignity," especially when you tried to mute it. That's when the cultural moment crystallized into a movement. Journalists began using the phrase, "the Washington effect," not in the political sense, but in terms of media. The Washington effect was shorthand for how audiences now viewed on-screen moments with more scrutiny. People were no longer asking, "What did he say?" but rather, "Why wasn't he allowed to say more?" And Colbert? He faded into a defensive posture. The show's writers tried damage control, bringing on more serious guests, cutting down the applause breaks, even allowing longer first segments. But it felt reactive, forced, like a PR strategy rather than a structural shift. Denzel, meanwhile, remained still. He made no follow-up interviews, no press tour. He simply carried on with his life, attending charity events, speaking at churches, mentoring young actors. And yet, his silence remained the loudest voice in the room. At one university lecture, a student stood up and asked a media studies professor, "Why do you think Denzel didn't return to the show or even clarify his side?" The professor responded, "Because when you know who you are, you don't explain your piece to people committed to misunderstanding you." That quote went viral too. People were hungry for integrity. And what Denzel demonstrated was not performative integrity, but rooted integrity. The kind that doesn't need optics, applause, or recovery arcs. And that posed a challenge, not just to Colbert, but to all of us. Because the truth is, we live in a culture obsessed with redemption arcs, manufactured comebacks, and post-scandal interviews. But what if the most powerful act is to not play at all? What if walking away and staying away is the most radical move? In the months that followed, more celebrities started pulling out of talk show appearances. Some cited scheduling conflicts. Others were more honest, saying they no longer felt these appearances served their message or their values. A shift was underway. Not a boycott, not a strike, but a quiet revolution. And at the center of it was a man who simply declined to perform. He didn't curse. He didn't storm out. He didn't call names. He just stopped playing the game. And in that stillness, something shifted, not just on that stage, but in the culture watching it. And that may be the most powerful form of activism left in our world. to step away from the noise, to speak without needing a microphone, to stand, not for applause, but for truth. As the media frenzy simmered, what became clearer than ever was this: Denzel Washington didn't just walk off a show, he walked into history, and history, as it does, began to reveal the deeper fault lines beneath the surface event. Colbert's team remained silent about the full details of what happened that night. Internally, they were scrambling. According to several unnamed staffers, the environment inside the studio changed almost overnight. Tension hung in the writer's room. Booking high-profile guests became more difficult. And more importantly, the audience, who once laughed on cue, had begun to look. Really look. You can tell when an audience has been awakened. There's a shift in body language. The applause becomes cautious. The laughter comes slower. The energy of blind trust turns into quiet examination. And that's exactly what had taken over the Colbert set. Ratings declined, not drastically, but perceptibly, enough for advertisers to start inquiring. And that's when networks start panicking. When money gets nervous, the truth starts bubbling up in back rooms. But Denzel? He kept moving in silence. Yet his name remained at the center of conversations. In fact, a strange thing happened. The walk-off moment became a cultural Rorschach test. People projected their values, frustrations, and ideals onto that 90-second clip. To some, Denzel was an ego-driven actor who couldn't handle being challenged. To others, he was a symbol of calm resistance in the face of performative liberalism. But to most, he became a metaphor for the growing disconnect between the media class and the rest of us. People weren't watching the clip just to see Denzel, they were watching to see themselves. How would I react in that chair? How often have I been interrupted, dismissed, misrepresented? How many times have I been invited to a table, only to find out they never planned to let me eat? That's the kind of impact this moment had. It didn't preach, it provoked. Meanwhile, other celebrities began speaking out, not about Denzel directly, but about the pressure of the circuit. One actress confessed in an interview, "We're coached before going on those shows. Don't be too serious. Don't get political. Keep it light. And if you drift off the funny path, they'll redirect or cut to commercial. It's exhausting. You're not a guest. You're a product." That quote made headlines. And suddenly, what Denzel had done, intuitively and calmly, was beginning to look more like a quiet revolution. One that didn't require slogans or protests, just presence, refusal, a simple no in the face of the machinery. You see, the most dangerous thing a person can do in a performance-driven society isn't to shout, it's to stop performing. Colbert's team, likely sensing this shift, tried to patch things up. Without naming Denzel, they aired a segment a week later highlighting deep conversations from past interviews. It felt hollow, an attempt to prove that they do let guests speak truth, so long as it's scripted, predictable, and preferably delivered with a punchline. The internet wasn't having it. A top comment on the YouTube upload of that segment read, "You can't curate authenticity after you just censored it." And underneath that, "Denzel was the most real thing that's ever happened on your stage. And you showed us what you do with reality. You push it off set." That comment received over 80,000 likes in 2 days. At the same time, something else began happening. Young Black creators on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube started stitching Denzel's clip with their own commentary. But it wasn't just analysis, it was storytelling. They used the moment as a springboard to discuss media gatekeeping, code switching in professional spaces, and how dignity is constantly negotiated in public life. One creator said it best. What Denzel did wasn't about ego. It was about ownership. He came with truth, and they tried to spin it into entertainment. He said no. That video was shared by Ava DuVernay, Issa Rae, and even Barack Obama's former speechwriter, John Favreau. Slowly but surely, Denzel's walk-off began to be taught in college classrooms. Media professors cited it as a watershed moment in post-pandemic public discourse. In one Ivy League lecture, a professor drew a parallel between the moment and James Baldwin's famous 1965 Cambridge debate. He explained, just as Baldwin confronted the hypocrisy of intellectual spaces in Britain, Denzel confronted the illusion of liberal openness in American media. They say they want truth, but only when it's palatable, only when it flatters the host. Meanwhile, a surprising ally emerged. Dave Chappelle, never shy of controversy, opened one of his stand-up sets by saying, Denzel walked off that set like a king, and Colbert? He sat there like he didn't know what just happened. Because that's the thing, they never expect a lion to roar without raising its voice. The crowd erupted. But there was another layer to this moment, one that not everyone saw coming. It wasn't just a media story, it became a spiritual one. Pastors began referencing Denzel's stance in sermons, not for the celebrity aspect, but as a metaphor for discernment and knowing when to leave spaces that no longer honor your truth. One viral sermon clip featured a preacher declaring, sometimes God removes you from the room, not because you failed, but because the room failed to see you. Denzel's name wasn't even mentioned, but the congregation knew exactly who he meant. In a time when so much of public discourse feels like a shouting match, where louder equals truer and outrage equals relevance, Denzel did something radical. He simply left, and that departure created a vacuum, one that sucked in analysis, reflection, anger, and ultimately awareness. Some began calling the moment Denzel's chair, not the literal chair he sat in, but the symbolic position he held, the guest who reversed the power dynamic, the one who, by removing himself, forced everyone to look closer at the stage, the host, and the game itself. The chair became a metaphor for presence and boundaries. Podcasters used it in titles. What would you do in Denzel's chair? Occupying the chair when you're invited, but not welcomed. The ripple had become a wave. And somewhere in that wave, a more uncomfortable truth emerged. Many of us had sat in that chair, in job interviews, on group projects, in classrooms, in families, moments where we were present, visible, but not truly heard. That was the magic and pain of the moment. Denzel's silence gave language to millions of people's daily realities. And yet, despite the praise and the think pieces and the tributes, Denzel never broke his silence. He didn't release a statement, didn't post a quote, didn't join the conversation, because he had already said what he needed to say, not with his words, but with his absence. And in that, he reminded a country addicted to constant commentary that sometimes the loudest statement is made by leaving the room. In the weeks that followed, the Denzel Colbert incident didn't fade. If anything, it evolved, taking on a life far beyond what either party may have imagined. There were interviews, exposes, deep dives from media outlets, and reaction videos that drew millions of views. But what persisted wasn't the event itself. It was the question, what does it mean to stand your ground in an era where performance is currency? And Denzel had offered a rare kind of answer, not wrapped in outrage or theatrics, but delivered through stillness. His departure became a cipher for integrity. Producers from other networks started quietly reaching out to his team. They wanted to set the record straight, to offer him a platform to speak his truth. He declined, every time, not out of spite, but because, according to those close to him, he had nothing to prove. In fact, his team didn't release any public statement. No press conference, no tweet, just silence. And in that silence, a certain kind of power solidified, one that no PR stunt could buy. But let's zoom out for a moment. This wasn't just a clash between a celebrity and a talk show host. It was emblematic of the collision between curated truth and lived experience, between media choreography and raw authenticity. Denzel didn't explode, didn't accuse, didn't flinch. He let the imbalance reveal itself. And then he removed himself from it. This was not a man caught off guard. This was a man who knew exactly where the floor dropped out and chose not to fall with it. Behind the scenes, People on Colbert's staff began to leak details. One admitted, anonymously, "We didn't expect him to push back. The joke was light on paper, but it clearly landed wrong. What shocked us was that he didn't try to make it okay for the audience. He didn't perform forgiveness. That's what threw us." There it was, perform forgiveness. An unspoken expectation baked into celebrity culture. To take the jab, to smile through the shade, to keep the gears turning. Denzel said, "Not this time." Interestingly, it wasn't just black communities who rallied behind him. A broader coalition emerged: educators, veterans, creatives, introverts, even spiritual leaders, who all saw themselves in that moment. The universal language of boundaries had been spoken, loud and clear. One therapist broke down the entire exchange in a viral video, saying, "What Denzel did was a classic example of boundary setting, and not in an aggressive way. He didn't scream, didn't fight. He simply refused to engage in a dynamic that was rooted in performance over presence." The comment section exploded. It wasn't about being right anymore. It was about being real. And then came the aftershocks. An unexpected one? Hollywood. Denzel's quiet resistance began influencing how other celebrities approached media. Interviews became less rehearsed. Some stopped doing press altogether unless it aligned with their values. A-list actors started requesting questions in advance, not to avoid tough conversations, but to avoid trap moments engineered for viral outrage. A few walked off mid-interview when lines were crossed. "You can thank Denzel," one director quipped during a roundtable. Studios began to worry. Publicists held meetings. They reviewed past interviews for signs of Denzel-style exits. It became an internal phrase. But it wasn't just fear driving these changes, it was respect. A grudging acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, audiences were tired of watching real people turned into clickbait. Meanwhile, Stephen Colbert stayed silent about the specifics. He returned to his usual programming. But the show, insiders claimed, never quite recovered its rhythm. The shift in energy was palpable. Even longtime fans began questioning the tone. One viral Reddit thread posed the question: "Is Colbert's shtick outdated? Have we outgrown the smile while patronizing you model?" Thousands responded. Many pointed back to Denzel's moment as the turning point. But Denzel? He just kept creating. He returned to his craft with even more clarity, directed a new film, delivered keynote speeches at colleges. And in each of these spaces, people leaned in a little more. Not because he shouted, but because they had seen what he wouldn't tolerate. That kind of authenticity can't be bought. It can only be lived. The incident even inspired art. A renowned playwright wrote a one-act drama loosely based on the encounter, titled The Guest Seat. It premiered off-Broadway to rave reviews. Audiences sat in stunned silence as the protagonist, clearly modeled after Denzel, slowly unraveled the host's attempts to control the narrative. Lines from the play echoed online. "If you don't want the truth, don't invite those who carry it. I don't need your stage. I carry my own spotlight. You dress this room in smiles, but I can still see the barbed wire." Colbert, for his part, never directly addressed the drama, and perhaps that was wise, because any response would only resurrect the moment he wished would fade. But for millions, it didn't fade. It transformed. The cultural conversation took one more turn when a high school debate coach included the Denzel clip as required viewing for her students. The exercise wasn't about drama, it was about discernment. She asked them, "What's the difference between defending yourself and choosing not to play the game at all?" One student's answer went viral: "Defending yourself still means you're accepting the rules." Denzel didn't argue. He just left. That's when you know the game's rigged, when silence makes the loudest noise. That clip was shared over 1 million times. The teacher was invited to panels. The curriculum was adopted in over 100 schools. And that's the impact. One moment, one choice. A man, not yelling, not grandstanding, just refusing to bend. And in doing so, he bent the conversation around him. Denzel Washington became more than an actor. In this chapter of public life, he became a mirror, reflecting back not just media hypocrisy, but the power we each have to remove ourselves from spaces that don't honor us. To choose silence not out of fear, but because words would only dilute the clarity of a boundary being drawn in real time. And the chair he left behind? It remains a symbol, an empty seat that speaks louder than any applause ever could. So the next time we find ourselves at a table that seems inviting but starts to feel performative, remember the chair. Remember Denzel. Remember the power of presence. Not every room deserves your truth. Not every host is there to listen. And not every invitation is meant to be accepted. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is get up and walk away.